Hello everybody, this is RRPG here, and I'm here to present another 2 cents video on the 2 cents block for you all. And I have a question for all of you. Why isn't Nintendo's hardware powerful? Well, this was pretty much a question that Adam Korilak said on YouTube when he presented a video about why is Nintendo's hardware not that powerful than its competition, especially when it comes to the more common hardware that they use right now, which are both the Wii and currently the Wii U. And he had some pretty good points to bring up about why Nintendo's hardware is not that powerful. He said that it's because Nintendo tries to remain economical with their hardware when it comes to the times. But then I watched Rich of ReviewTechUSA's counterpoint video, and he disagrees on a lot of Adam Korilak's responses and saying that Nintendo did have powerful hardware before, but made incorrect decisions, especially when it came to like stuff like storage mediums or optical mediums, as well as some of the stuff that people wanted for the standards of gaming from back then up until now. Now, here's my response to what I believe, based on all of this. So, this is kind of a bit of a retrospective, so don't really take this, don't really take it as me trying to correct them or anything, as I do agree and disagree on a lot of their points, but this is me just kind of playing devil's advocate for the most part. And first of all, I will say that from what I heard from them before, when they talked at the beginning, they said that they actually do really like the Wii U, and that is a good thing. And they say that there is really good potential for it, but it's just there's a lot of things that Nintendo needs to do in order to fix things correctly, or just to get things done in the right track, or get it set back in the right track with some other ways. But there is a lot of potential to where it can actually improve. Now, enough talk about that. Let's go ahead and talk about my response. So, taking a look back at Nintendo's first console, the NES. Now, we all know that the console was the one that was revolutionary for its time, as it revolutionized gaming after the video game crash of 1983 and 84. And it brought about games in a different direction that were never done for the Atari 2600, or from games from the past generation, which was, I think, was the second generation of gaming, which was where the Atari 2600, the ColecoVision, and Television, and all those were at. So most of the games that you actually saw, they were actually points-based, or they actually were very simple. But when you take a look at games that were done like on the NES and the Sega Master System, they had more of a direction, like they had more linearity to where there was actually a beginning and an end. So they actually brought something new to the table. And Nintendo was able to get a stranglehold on most third parties because of their decision on the hardware. And they managed to grab a lot of those third parties to where they actually allowed them to develop games on their console, but they still had that whole thing where they could develop a certain number of games within a year to maintain quality assurance between all publishers and developers. Now, Gunpei Yokoi's strategy when it came to the Game Boy was something that I agreed with ReviewTechUSA on. He said that the Game Boy is far different from the console strategy, while the handheld section is very, is the complete opposite. And that means that if the hardware on the handheld side was weaker than the competition, then it would garner in a lot of support from third parties as well as first party support, and it would garner in a lot of sales from the public. And in a sense, it actually did work that way, especially when it came to the Game Boy, and then the Game Boy Color, the Game Boy Pocket, and the Game Boy Advance, and then the DS and the 3DS. Yeah, that all worked well, but we all know what happened with the Virtual Boy, as that's a pretty much different story, as it pretty much backstabbed Gunpei Yokoi's philosophy about handheld hardware, and he was ostracized for that decision. But enough talk about that. And we also have to take into account that Nintendo had great support on both sides when it came to both the console and handheld fronts, and that it made not only that, but they also had great support from not only their side, but third parties as well, and it made the system a profitable device in the end. And it sold over 60 million units, so that's a pretty impressive number. Now let's take a look at the Super Nintendo, the next generation, which was the 4th generation of gaming. And we all know that the Sega Genesis came out first before the Super Nintendo did, and it released in 1989, whereas the Super Nintendo, I think it released in 1990 in Japan, but it released in 1991 for the Western market. So when I say 2 years after Sega Genesis, I'm meaning for the Western market, not for Japan's market. And the SNES had some time to blow that console out of the water with a lot of things that it actually went for in terms of the tech side. Now, despite Sega making decent comebacks throughout the whole generation when it competed with the Super Nintendo, the hardware on the NES actually made the system look next gen over the Sega Genesis, especially when it came to the sound chip that was delivered into Sony's. That came from Sony's hardware that was in the Super Nintendo. And that was a really strong point for the hardware because it made most of the original soundtracks actually sound very well, even sound really well for today's standards, especially when it comes to like Simon Belmont's theme from Super Castlevania 4 or even Final Fantasy 6 soundtrack, or what we called Final Fantasy 3 at the time, or even Secret of Mana for that matter. And another thing is that the graphics engine had a 256 color palette, while the Sega Genesis had a 64 color palette. So that meant that games on the Super Nintendo can actually portray more color and actually look a bit more realistic. And what I mean by realistic, or look really dynamic in the color scheme, just take a look at games like Donkey Kong Country or Super Mario RPG for that matter. I mean, when you take a look at games like that, that managed to revolutionize gaming even more, and it managed to, and games like those managed to boost sales in the hardware, the Super Nintendo, because of that big revolution. And even first and third party games in many genres made the system very profitable and enjoyable, and it actually really paved a way for a lot of great games to actually be on that system for the most part. So that's how Nintendo managed to do well, was not only did they have really strong support, but their hardware had a lot of feats in where they actually made them, made the company a good step in the right direction, and it really helped build up the strong relationships between not only them as well as second-party and third-party developers. But by the time when the Nintendo 64 came about, that's where the crap hit the fan, and the system was announced as the most powerful hardware in the 5th generation. It was ahead of its competition because even though that the Atari Jaguar was the first 64-bit console, but Nintendo 64 actually made 64-bit gaming or 3D gaming actually a really strong point for a console in itself. But the problem was that Nintendo didn't opt in for CDs, as that's what pretty much PlayStation did back at the time. And Nintendo was still using cartridges, and a lot of third parties actually abandoned the system in favor of the PlayStation 1 because with CDs they can offer in more data to where developers can actually implement more ideas into their games and make sure that it can play well and run really well. But then again, when it came to CDs, there was the awful loading screens, so that was kind of a double-edged sword. But people opted in for the CDs because it was a more streamlined optical device at the time. And speaking of which, Square's dispute with Nintendo, when it came to the Nintendo 64, was a really big turning point for third-party support on Nintendo platforms, especially when it came to the consoles. And Nintendo had to rely on themselves and Rareware to make sure that their systems sold well. And to this day, the Nintendo 64, I think it sold over 30 million units, which is not bad, but it's just a shame to know that the system didn't really do that well as its predecessors because of the poor decision to continue using cartridges, and it costs so much to manufacture those to the public. So, yeah, that was a really bad decision, but then again, that was mostly on the late Hiroshi Yamauchi's part, but then again, that was history and this is now. So, next up, let's take a look at the GameCube. It was the second most powerful hardware, and it was behind the Xbox, whereas the PlayStation 2 was the weaker of the hardware. Well, actually, I think it was the Dreamcast, but PlayStation 2 was the second most weakest hardware. But the problem with the GameCube was that it suffered the same thing as the Nintendo 64. I mean, it was cool that the optical medium that they used were discs this time around, that time around, but it was very short, as you could possibly fit. I think what ReviewTechUSA said that you could possibly fit at least a gigabyte of data for that type of disc that they had, but it still wasn't enough for people to put in enough data space into those games to make sure that they can, create really big games and optimize their performance, that kind of matter. Even though the GameCube was a very powerful system, it still had some optical things or optimization that actually made it more impressive than the PlayStation 2, especially when it came to like Resident Evil 4, when the graphics and the loading times were actually very, very well done. But the thing with the PlayStation 2 that managed to outdo the GameCube was that it dominated the competition because I think it was the first one that started online gaming, and then Microsoft with the Xbox Live, it actually came after that, but that's when it really took off with online gaming at that moment. But also, the PlayStation 2 originally had a DVD player, and the DVD player in the PlayStation 2 was what made Sega raise the white flag with the Dreamcast and any further development of consoles. So that's why they pulled out of the hardware race and started to become more of a game developer in this day and age. And Sony managed to corner the market at the time with first and third-party support because of development costs. A lot of people were really liking the technology of the PlayStation 2, and they made some really good games. There was a lot of great games that came out of the PlayStation 2 that I really liked, especially Kingdom Hearts 2, and even the Onimusha games and the Devil May Cry games for that matter. I mean, there were a lot of games that came out for the PlayStation 2 that I was like, oh wow, this is really good. And Nintendo struggled to get things done right, even by the time when Satoru Iwata stepped in as Nintendo's president after he succeeded Hiroshi Yamauchi, and he did a lot of things to try to get the system back on track. But pretty much the coffin had already been nailed. I mean, it was done. Even with third-party exclusives, they didn't even become commercially successful because of poor decisions. I mean, the Capcom 5 was pretty much the prime example of this fact, where games like Dead Phoenix, I think that's what it was called, and then Beautiful Joe, Product Number 03, Resident Evil 4, Killer 7, that's what it was. Okay. And even though those games from the Capcom 5 were actually fun and awesome, it made Capcom betray their agreement with Nintendo in making sure that they keep those games on the system, but they weren't even commercially successful, or Capcom didn't see the GameCube as a profitable system. And much of the Japanese support was on Sony's side because of how well the PlayStation 2 was doing, and Nintendo was struggling really hard to try to make sure that the GameCube actually did well, even though they pretty much had to rely on themselves, and they no longer had Rare to help them because of their breakup in 2002. But they did actually make some partnerships in the long run, where they had Namco bring Soul Calibur 2 to the GameCube, where they had Link as a playable character, and that turned out to be the best-selling platform for that game in the franchise. Now, let's take a look at the Wii. Now, we know this is the first console done by Nintendo where it was behind in terms of the power in the hardware. And it ended up being a huge success in the end because of the system going for the casuals. And the casuals at the time, that was a really prominent thing because they started to get into gaming because of games like Halo and even the newer Grand Theft Auto games at the time. But most of the casuals were... but what Nintendo did was they got casuals, especially when it came to people who didn't play games much, actually interested in the Wii because of games like Wii Sports and some of those other games that were on there that actually took advantage of the Wii's motion controls. But the long story short is that the system didn't really appeal to everyone. It still had great games to it, but it didn't really appeal to everyone. I know a lot of people who preferred the Xbox 360 and PS3 didn't really prefer the Wii because of it being a casual console and for the motion control fad that it was going for. And despite the console itself being the most sold console ever, no, it was the PlayStation 2, but despite being Nintendo's most successfully sold home console, third-party support still gave the console, or still gave Nintendo the cold shoulder. I mean, many of the third parties saw the Wii as nothing but a cash cow, and instead of them taking it seriously, they just only saw it to actually make a quick buck, and they didn't really make any really great games for it. I mean, there were some great third-party games now and then, like I think Zack and Wiki, No More Heroes, even Red Steel 2, and I think the Resident Evil Chronicles games, the rail shooters or whatever. There were, and House of the Dead Overkill for that matter. There were still some good games here and there, but for the most part, it's just third parties. They didn't really favor the Wii that much. They weren't taking it seriously, as they were pretty much spending most of their time with the 360 and PS3. And if you take a look at what happened in the past generation, a lot of development studios and publishers actually shut down because of poor economical decisions. And despite a few, as I said, despite a few that were actually pretty good on the console, like I said, none of them took it seriously. And the optical medium and online gaming for the Wii became another problem for gamers. And other certain features like Netflix didn't come into effect for the Wii until much later, but that's another can of worms left to be unopened. But it's just, in the end, the Wii, even though it wasn't the most powerful console and it had a really good premise and some really good games, it didn't really gain that much favorable reception with most gamers, especially the core gamers, as well as those from third parties. So Nintendo really needed to do something with their next generation console, and that's when the Wii U comes in. Nintendo's current generation system. And Nintendo's current system is met with both positivity and negativity from not only gamers, but from critics as well as investors. And it pretty much caught up with a lot of the standards of today's gaming, especially when it came to the optical medium, which is about the equivalent of a single-layer Blu-ray disc, and as well as online gaming, but third parties still, would not even come to it. And the Wii U, I will say, the Wii U as of right now has a stellar amount of games on there, even from some third-party developers, and mostly the first-party franchises. When I talk about third parties, I mean games like Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, and even Resident Evil Revelations on the Wii U, even DuckTales Remastered, and oh man, and I think even Deus Ex Human Revolution Director's Cut, but I've talked about how bad it sold on there, but that's, like I said, another can of worms that's not relevant to the subject. But, there were still some good third-party games here and there, but most of the first-party stuff actually were pretty damn decent. And I think Sonic Lost World, I know a lot of people don't even like that game, but that was the game that I actually liked. And speaking of which, third-party exclusives from partnerships with Nintendo actually have made a very good impression on the system, and it actually made the system very appealing. And some of those ones that are developed by third parties that are coming out from Nintendo, like Hyrule Warriors, even though it's developed by Tecmo Koei and Team Ninja, that's still a really big thing that's going to make the system very appealing, and I know a lot of people are still looking forward to that. But the thing that we all had to keep in mind is people didn't really get into the system beforehand, and still are not getting into the system now because they feel that the gamepad is unnecessary. And a lot of people to this day are still thinking that the gamepad is nothing but an accessory for the Wii. And that's very sad when you think about it. But personally, I think it got better by the time when Mario Kart 8 came around, and I think it's going to be a lot better when the new Smash Brothers comes about, because I think that's when people are going to realize, hey, this is a next-gen system, so maybe we really shouldn't have been sidestepping it all this time. And, I personally think there is a lot of potential for Nintendo to utilize the gamepad for the right reasons. And it seems like they are going to utilize more of the gamepad for the right reasons ever since what we saw from E3 of this year, especially when it came to Mario Maker, as well as the Amiibos, as well as some other things that we possibly don't even know about. So it's good that they're trying so hard to take the initiative to try to make sure that the gamepad is very mandatory for some games later on down the road, even future games too. But Nintendo's biggest problem with the Wii U was at the beginning, as they banked on third parties to sell the Wii U at first, because they wanted them to try and succeed well on the platform, but it failed. And this caused a huge drought of software during 2003 for the company. And a lot of people were criticizing Nintendo for that, and they suffered their third consecutive loss within the fiscal year of 2013 in March of 2004. And after being out for over a year from its competitors, it was still outsold by the PlayStation 4 by at least, I think, I would want to say at least 25%. I could be mistaken, but from the PlayStation 4, it still managed to outsell it within, hardly within that system's first year. And I think that the Wii U still has a lot of years ahead of it right now, despite what skeptics say. But I also feel that third parties should not abandon the Wii U, despite it being a very different beast to develop for. And there is a lot of great potential for the Wii U to actually build up into a very prominent system than just the PS4 and the Xbox One, because not only does Nintendo need to have its own games, but they also need to make sure that third parties are catering to them, so that way they can develop for their platform, and that way they can try to relive the days of the Super Nintendo. Now, granted, we probably won't see another time like the Super Nintendo where both first and third parties actually coincided with each other to bring out some really great content, but you never know. Maybe Nintendo's next generation hardware will be that defining factor where it will actually bring down all those problems to where Nintendo can actually see that union once more. But it's kind of hard to say at this point. So in the end, let me go ahead and give my final thoughts on all this on this matter. I will say that ReviewTechUSA, for the most part, was right about what he said, but I do believe that Adam Korilak had some really good points of what he had to say too. And Nintendo will probably come to the point where they will be ahead of everything with newer consoles from here on out, but where they have to have certain features, certain technology, and whatever else that they can get their hands on to make their next generation systems sell well. But there's still a lot of other feats that they would need to do too to make sure that their next generation consoles, even after the Wii U, will actually do well for them. And granted, the Wii U can do fine if it manages to profit in the long run, as even though I'm also going to say this right there, right here. If they manage to be behind its competitors but still do strongly than the GameCube, then I do believe that in the long run, if it does turn out to be profitable for a console, which is now where the Wii U is at this point, then it should be okay if they got last place. But it still would be enough if they, managed to get in a lot of sales like its competition, but that's kind of hard to say at the moment. And Nintendo may most likely be around to create more consoles than its competition, because when you take a look at Sony and Microsoft, they may end up raising the white flag because of how bad their business structure has been for quite some time. When it comes to Sony, it is probably in the most dire situation right now, because with them bleeding money on a yearly basis and, suffering consecutive losses year after year. And, it's at that point where they're about to declare bankruptcy. I mean, if they want to keep the PlayStation division alive, then they're going to have to make that as its own brand and straight away from Sony and not be a part of Sony anymore if Sony is going to be going down. And Microsoft has had a massive layoff of over 18,000 people in light of the Xbox Entertainment Service actually being closed down. So there is that possibility where even though they were trying to get themselves as an entertainment business, they may actually have to brand the Xbox as its own brand, as well as Sony branding the PlayStation as its own brand outside of the homeowners or whatever. But in the end, I guess we'll just have to wait and see near the end of the decade, this decade, to see what the next generation of gaming holds. And I definitely have a lot of faith that there is going to be a time where all consoles, all the, Nintendo and its competitors, that they have really good hardware on both their ends to where developers will easily develop for on all sides, and competition will be really good, because that's what generations need, is that they need competition, because the more sales that they garner from us, we all win as gamers, because we're going to get some really good games on all the platforms that we play on. So hopefully that will come to fruition, sometime within the next 10 or 20 years or so. But for right now, hopefully there will be lots of things that will actually rectify the situation for not only Nintendo's case, but for also its competitors. But for Nintendo possibly making the most powerful hardware sometime in the future, it may be possible, but it's kind of hard to tell. It's up to Satoru Iwata for the matter, but we'll have to see how that goes, like I said. But anyway, that's all I have to say on the matter, so I want to know what you guys think. Do you guys believe that Nintendo is okay with developing hardware as they're at, or do you believe that they need to develop really powerful hardware in order to compete with their competitors, or meet up with stuff that people want for today's standards, like the Twitch app, or some other things like online gaming and stuff, that will make Nintendo a very compelling system for people to actually play on? Be sure to rate this video, as well as leaving your positive and negative feedback down in the comments. Also, be sure to hit that subscribe button underneath that video, as more support from you guys means that more content is coming from me in the future that you won't even find anywhere else. And until next time, this is RRPG signing off by saying Godspeed and game on, gamers. Have a good one.
You